The humidity pressed against Dr. Elena Vega's skin as she slashed through another curtain of vines. Her research team had been mapping this remote section of the Amazon for 3 weeks, documenting plant species and terrain that few outsiders had ever seen. "Hold up," called Marco, their guide, raising his hand. "There's something strange ahead." Elena wiped sweat from her brow and followed his gaze. Through a gap in the canopy, sunlight glinted off something metallic, something that didn't belong in this ancient green world. "It's man-made," said Dr. Chen, adjusting his glasses. "And big." They approached cautiously, machetes clearing a path until the object came fully into view. Jaws dropped. An aircraft, its fuselage cracked and consumed by moss and rust, lay half-buried in the forest floor. The wings had been sheared off by the trees it had crashed through decades ago. "It's military," Elena whispered, running her fingers over a faded insignia. "World War II era, maybe?" Inside the cockpit, they found remnants of what had once been a pilot. The uniform had mostly rotted away, but a leather bag beneath the seat remained somewhat intact. Elena carefully extracted a weathered journal, its pages yellow and fragile. "There's something written here," she said, squinting at faded ink. "Coordinates and some kind of code." Dr. Chen checked the aircraft's identification number against their satellite phone database. "That's odd. No records match this plane. According to official history, this aircraft doesn't exist." Back at their research station, Elena spread the journal pages carefully on a clean surface. The team crowded around, flashlights illuminating the faded text. Rain drummed against the tin roof as they worked into the night. "Some of these entries are mundane flight logs," said Professor Williams, their historian. "But here, these coordinates don't match the plane's supposed flight path. And look at these repeated references to Package Delta." Elena nodded, pointing to another page. The writer mentions an unexpected passenger several times. No name, just the passenger, or sometimes the asset. They cross-referenced the plane's markings with military archives through their satellite connection. Hours passed, with nothing but dead ends. "It doesn't make sense," Chen muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. "The insignia clearly belongs to the 107th Transport Squadron, but there's no record of this particular aircraft. It's like someone erased it." Marco, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "My grandfather fought with the Allied forces. He told stories about secret missions, planes that flew without records, carrying people who officially didn't exist." Elena felt a chill despite the jungle heat. She turned the journal to its final entries, where the handwriting became increasingly erratic. "Weather worsening. Compass malfunctioning. Passenger agitated," she read aloud, and the last entry. "Something's wrong. Not just the storm. He knows. God help us if—" The entry ended mid-sentence, leaving only questions hanging in the humid air. Elena couldn't shake the mystery of the nameless aircraft. After returning to Chicago, she contacted Dr. Lawrence Bennett, a renowned historian specializing in World War II aviation. They met at his cluttered university office, walls lined with model planes and faded photographs of bomber squadrons. Bennett's eyes lit up when Elena showed him photos of the wreckage. "This insignia," he said, tapping the screen with a gnarled finger. "It belongs to a special operations wing that ran classified missions, mostly transport of sensitive personnel or materials. Can you identify the specific aircraft?" Bennett frowned, scrolling through more images. "That's the problem. This identification number doesn't exist in any official record I've seen, and I've spent 40 years studying these archives." He pulled a thick binder from his shelf, flipping through yellowed pages of declassified documents. "See? The numbering sequence jumps from WR5392 to WR5394. Your plane, WR5393, is simply missing." "Could it be a record-keeping error?" Elena asked. Bennett shook his head. Military documentation was meticulous, especially for aircraft. This wasn't an oversight. Someone deliberately removed this plane from history. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though they were alone. During the war, when missions were too sensitive, records were sometimes altered or destroyed. Whatever your plane was carrying, someone wanted it forgotten. But why? Elena asked. That, said Bennett, is the right question. With Bennett's help, Elena and Chen gained access to recently declassified military archives in Washington. They spent days sifting through dusty files, searching for any mention of the mysterious flight. Look at this, Chen said late one afternoon, spreading a faded document across the table. It's a maintenance report from March 1944 requesting parts for UR-5393, our plane. Elena scanned the document. So it did exist in official records, at least briefly. Further digging unearthed a partial flight manifest. The page was damaged, but they could make out pilot, co-pilot, radio operator, and a curious entry at the bottom. Passenger, special clearance. No name was provided. That matches the journal references, Elena said, but we found remains of the crew at the crash site. Where was this passenger? Chen shook his head. No additional remains were in the wreckage. Either they survived or someone took them, Elena finished, along with whatever package Delta was. That evening, a senior archivist approached their table. I couldn't help overhearing your research, he said quietly. There's something you should see. Iska led them to a basement storage room and unlocked a cabinet filled with overlooked files. These are reports of unresolved disappearances during the war. Intelligence officers, scientists, even a few diplomats who vanished without explanation. He handed them a folder. Some were rumored to be on unofficial transport flights to South America. Elena opened the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the brittle pages. The list of missing personnel gave Elena and Chen their first real leads. After weeks of phone calls and emails, they tracked down family members of the missing crew. Most had long accepted the official story, that their loved ones died when their plane went down in bad weather over the Pacific. In Boston, they met Martha Donovan, 87 years old, whose father had been the radio operator. Her small apartment was filled with memories, photographs, medals, and carefully preserved letters. Dad came back from the war, she said, pouring them tea with shaky hands. But he was never the same. He'd wake up screaming about things he saw in the jungle. Did he talk about his missions? Elena asked gently. Martha's eyes clouded. Only once, when he'd had too much to drink. He said there was a flight that never happened, with a passenger who shouldn't have existed. Mom told him to hush. Next day, men in suits visited. Dad never spoke of it again. In Florida, they interviewed James Kerrigan, a 93-year-old veteran who had served in the same squadron. You found it, didn't you? He asked, before they explained why they'd come. The ghost plane. His weathered hands trembled as he reached for a locked drawer. Been waiting 70 years for someone to ask the right questions. But listen carefully. You're stirring up dangerous waters. He removed a faded photograph showing 5 young airmen standing before a plane. The identification number was clearly visible. WR-5393. Some secrets, he whispered, were meant to stay buried. Armed with Kerrigan's photo, Elena and Chen returned to the archives with renewed purpose. The archivists now took their research seriously, granting access to previously restricted files. Here it is, Chen said, carefully unfolding a brittle telegram dated April 1944. Official notice that a transport plane was lost in bad weather near Panama. But the coordinates are hundreds of miles from where we found the wreckage. Elena compared the crew names. Same pilot and co-pilot, but different radio operator than Donovan. They created a false report. Deeper in the files, they discovered something more disturbing. a series of classified communications between military commanders. All records of Flight WR5393 to be destroyed immediately, Elena read aloud. Personnel files altered to reflect routine assignments. Families to be informed of training accident over Pacific. No mention of passenger or cargo under any circumstances. Chen whistled softly. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to erase this mission. Another document caught Elena's eye. A medical report about a scientist working on a classified project who had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and was being transported to a secure facility. The date matched their mystery flight. What if the passenger was this scientist? Elena suggested. Someone important enough to create an elaborate cover-up? As they prepared to leave, an elderly security guard approached. "Be careful with what you're digging up," he said quietly. "Some folks still check who accesses those old files." That night, Elena noticed a dark sedan parked outside her hotel. It was gone by morning, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Elena couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Back at her university, she consulted Dr. Abigail Winters, a historian specializing in wartime intelligence operations. They met in a quiet corner of the campus coffee shop, away from prying ears. "Your aircraft," Winters said, reviewing their findings, "fits a pattern I've been researching for years. During the war, both sides were desperate for technological advantages and the scientists who could create them." She pulled out copies of intelligence memos she'd collected over decades. "Look at these reports. German scientists defecting, Allied operations to extract key personnel from occupied territories, a race to secure mines, not just materials." Chen leaned forward. "You think the passenger was a scientist? Someone valuable enough to risk a mission into neutral territory?" Winters nodded. South America was a hotbed of covert operations. Both Axis and Allied powers operated there despite official neutrality policies. But what was so important about this particular scientist? Elena wondered. "That's where it gets interesting," Winters said. In early 1944, there were rumors about a German physicist who had made a breakthrough in a project that could potentially end the war. The Allies were desperate to get him out. "And if the extraction went wrong?" Chen asked. "Then everyone involved would become a liability. The mission, the plane, the crew, even the scientist, all would need to disappear completely." Elena thought about the crashed plane, hidden by the jungle for 8 decades. But why keep it secret after all this time? Winters' expression darkened. "Because some weapons are too terrible to acknowledge, even now." Elena and Chen returned to the journal, focusing on the mysterious coordinates scattered throughout its pages. After plotting them on a map, they realized they formed a pattern, not random locations, but a deliberate path leading deeper into the jungle, miles from the crash site. "These aren't distress signals," Chen said. "They're directions." "The EI pilot must have written them before the crash," Elena reasoned. "Maybe they were headed somewhere specific, somewhere important." They consulted with Marco via video call, sharing the coordinates. His expression grew serious as he recognized the area. "That's bad territory," he warned. "Very remote. Local tribes avoid it. They say the place is cursed. That strange lights and noises came from there during the time of their grandparents." Despite Marco's concerns, Elena and Chen prepared for another expedition. They secured emergency funding from the university, claiming it was for further environmental research. The night before their departure, Elena received an unmarked envelope at her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Stop now. You're not prepared for what you'll find." She showed it to Chen, who immediately wanted to cancel the trip. But Elena's determination had only grown stronger. "Don't you see? This proves we're onto something big. Someone doesn't want us to find whatever's at those coordinates." They took precautions, telling multiple colleagues about their research, leaving copies of their findings in secure locations, and arranging regular check-ins during their expedition. As their plane approached the South American airport, Elena noticed a man in a dark suit watching them from the terminal. When she looked again, he was gone. The jungle welcomed them back with its overwhelming heat and cacophony of wildlife. Marco had recruited 2 local guides who knew the remote area they were targeting. 4 days into their trek, Elena sensed something was wrong. "We're being followed," Marco whispered as they set up camp on the 4th night. "For at least 2 days now." Chen looked nervously into the darkening forest. "Are you sure it's not just animals?" Marco shook his head. "Animals don't try to hide their tracks. Whoever's out there knows what they're doing." They took turns keeping watch that night. During her shift, Elena thought she saw a brief flash of light in the distance, like someone signaling. By morning, she convinced herself she had imagined it. They returned from a brief survey of the area to find their camp in disarray. Tents were slashed, equipment scattered, and their satellite phones smashed beyond repair. Most concerning, the journal and their maps were missing. "We should go back," one of the guides pleaded. "This place is not safe." That evening, the second guide disappeared while gathering firewood. They searched until darkness made it impossible to continue. "I've heard stories," the remaining guide whispered as they huddled around a small fire, "of men who protect old secrets in these jungles. Men without names who work for governments or organizations so secret even they don't know who truly employs them." "Ghost stories to scare us," Chen said, but his voice lacked conviction. At dawn, they found footprints around their camp. Military boots, not the guide's worn shoes. And on a tree, carved fresh into the bark, "Leave now." Marco studied the message, then looked at Elena. These aren't local people. These marks were made with a military knife. Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, Elena insisted. They press on. Chen had memorized the coordinates, and Marco proved skilled enough to navigate without their stolen maps. The remaining guide refused to continue, choosing to return to the village alone. "We're close," Elena said as they hacked through particularly dense vegetation. The jungle had grown eerily quiet, birds and monkeys conspicuously absent. "The air feels strange here," Marco noted. "Heavier somehow." They emerged into a small clearing and stopped short. Ahead stood a concrete structure, half buried by earth and strangled by vines, clearly man-made, clearly old. "This shouldn't be here," Chen whispered. "There are no records of any construction in this area." The bunker entrance was partially collapsed, but they managed to squeeze through. Inside, their flashlights revealed a scene frozen in time. Rusted equipment covered tables, filing cabinets stood open as if hastily searched, and faded technical diagrams hung from walls. "It's some kind of research facility," Chen said, examining what appeared to be laboratory equipment. Elena found a faded sign in German, then another in English. This was a joint operation. "Look at these dates, 1944. In what must have been an office, they discovered a heavy safe, its combination lock still intact. Unlike everything else, it showed signs of regular maintenance. Someone had kept it accessible. "Can we open it?" Chen asked. Marco examined the lock. "Maybe, but that's not what worries me." He pointed to fresh footprints in the dust. "Someone was here recently, very recently." As if responding to his observation, a distant sound echoed. An engine, approaching, from the direction they had come. "We need to get that safe open," Elena said urgently. "Now." Marco worked on the safe, while Elena and Chen barricaded the entrance. The sound of vehicles had stopped, replaced by voices and footsteps moving through the jungle. "Got it," Marco whispered, as the safe door swung open with a groan of protest. Inside lay a metal canister containing rolls of microfilm, a leather-bound logbook, and several small vials sealed in lead containers. Elena carefully removed the microfilm and held it to her flashlight. "It's in German and English," she said, squinting at the tiny images. Project Kronos, a joint research operation started in secret after both sides realized they were working on similar theoretical weapons. Chen leafed through the logbook. According to this, they recruited scientists from both Axis and Allied powers, men and women who believed the war had gone too far and wanted to prevent either side from obtaining certain technologies. Elena's hands trembled as she read more of the microfilm. I can't believe what I'm seeing. They were working on manipulating time itself, creating a weapon that could selectively remove people, buildings, even entire cities from the timeline. That's impossible, Marco said. They thought so too until they achieved a partial success, Elena continued. But there was a catastrophic accident. Several researchers simply disappeared, not died, vanished, as if they'd never existed. Chen pointed to an entry in the logbook. The passenger on our plane was Dr. Werner Kleist, the project's lead scientist. After the accident, he suffered a breakdown and insisted on shutting everything down. He was being transported to a secure facility when the plane crashed, Elena finished. But there's more. The project directors feared the technology might be weaponized despite the dangers. They couldn't destroy their research, so they hid it, creating false records to make it seem the project never existed. Voices grew louder outside. Someone was clearing debris from the entrance. According to this final note, Chen said, they left watchers, people sworn to ensure these secrets stayed buried. Watchers who are still out there, Marco whispered, and getting closer. Elena quickly photographed the microfilm with her phone, while Chen gathered the logbook and vials. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, metal scraping against concrete as they cleared the entrance barricade. There's another way out, Marco said, pointing to a partially collapsed corridor. We might squeeze through. They navigated the narrow passage, emerging into the jungle 50 yards from the bunker. Through the trees, they caught glimpses of men in unmarked tactical gear entering the facility. We need to get back to civilization, Chen whispered as they moved quietly through the undergrowth. For 2 days, they traveled without stopping, taking turns to rest during brief breaks. On the third morning, they reached a small village with a radio. Marco arranged for transportation to the nearest city. In a hotel room with secure internet, they reviewed Elena's photographs of the microfilm and debated their next move. We have proof of an 80-year conspiracy, Elena said. A technology so dangerous it frightened the scientists who created it, frightened them enough to fake their own deaths and create an organization to guard the secret. If we go public, Chen warned, we'll never be safe. These watchers have operated for generations. They won't stop because we expose them. Marco, who had been quiet, finally spoke. Maybe they're right to keep this hidden. Imagine this technology in the hands of any government, any military, the ability to erase people from history. Elena looked at her phone, at the evidence they'd risked their lives to obtain. But scientific knowledge can't be buried forever. Eventually, someone else will discover the same principles. So what do we do? Chen asked. Before Elena could answer, her phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. The choice you make now will determine more than you know. Choose wisely. Outside their window, an elderly man sat on a bench across the street, watching their hotel. He wore an ordinary suit, but his posture was unmistakably military. When he saw Elena looking, he nodded slightly. We have until morning to decide, Elena said, turning back to her colleagues. Do we expose a conspiracy that has lasted 80 years, or do we become part of it? The answer hung in the air between them, as heavy as the jungle humidity, as consequential as history itself.